The worst thing that can happen to a socialist is to have his country ruled by socialists who are not his friends. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Today we have Gary Chartier. He is the author of Anarchy and Legal Order, along with Economic Justice and Natural Law. He is a consultant, speaker, coach, writer, philosopher, and teacher. Check him out. His website is in the description. Mr. Chartier, thank you for your time.
Pleasure to be here.
What do you mean when you say we support markets?
Well, I guess it depends on who we is, but when I say I support markets, I mean that open exchange is both predicated on people's freedom to dispose of their labor and their insights and their property, and that open exchange is widely, generally beneficial.
I should have said you. I was looking at your quote from Center for a Stateless Society. So something like markets, you could think of slave markets, you could think of human trafficking today. Are those part of this philosophy? Is that a shortcoming of philosophy?
So, on my view, a credible market order depends on underlying rights. Right? It's not, to talk about the value of markets is not to say that anything and everything is in principle subject to third-party exchanges. And so, since I think that people have rights not to be subjected to physical force, not to have their bodies controlled or injured forcibly, and not to have their justly acquired possessions misappropriated, then that obviously gets in the way, certainly of slave markets and of things like that. So I'm absolutely not saying anything and everything should be exchanged. I don't think slave contracts are enforceable. I certainly don't think involuntary enslavement is ever okay. So yeah, my support for markets is not a support for enslavement.
What is a freed market?
So the reason a lot of us, thanks to the great William Gillis, use the expression freed market is to emphasize that very often in contemporary political discourse, we find people throwing around the language of the free market and seeming to mean by that a not very free at all market, very much the market that we often have today, markets that are rigged, markets that are hamstrung, markets that are riddled with privilege of various kinds. And so we talk about the freed market, that is the liberated market, to emphasize the difference between the kind of freedom we favor and the illusory freedom that is sometimes affirmed of existing markets by those perhaps a bit more invested in the status quo.
Now, let's say I have a worldview where I want to make sure people in powerful positions are held accountable. Why should I support markets?
Well, so people in positions of power, because they're in positions of power, are hard to hold accountable. Let's begin with that recognition. Even when we have glorious words written down on paper that tell us that people in power are accountable, either because they're accountable to voters, or they're accountable to congressional investigators, or they're accountable to journalists. The reality is that once you have power, it becomes increasingly and unsurprisingly easy for you to insulate yourself against power, against inquiry, against assessment, against accountability. And so it seems to me that, not to put too fine a point on it, the best way to insulate people against abuses of power, the best way to protect against abuses of power, is to reduce the amount of power that anybody has. And by power here, I don't mean influence or something vague like that. I mean the ability to deploy physical force on a systematic basis. And so by reducing the amount of free play for the forcible exercise of power, and by increasing opportunities for consensual exchange, consensual interaction, and that's really, as Charles Johnson suggests in the broad sense, what the market is, the space of voluntary consensual interaction, then I think we reduce the opportunity for people with power to act badly. Now, that doesn't mean that if you've got a structure in which people have power, there's no way to try to hold them accountable. But I think we should begin with the recognition that it's very easy once you have power to insulate yourself against attempts to hold you accountable. So that reducing the reach of power seems like the first step toward actually ensuring you don't have to worry about holding abusive, powerful people accountable.
Now, I look at the marketplace and even a freed market, I wouldn't really see them catering to me necessarily. Whereas if I have a government, I constantly have politicians trying to please me, trying to win over my vote. Does the existence of a state allow me as a citizen to actually engage in society and really be valued and have dignity? Whereas the marketplace is more of a dog-eat-dog place. If I want to live with dignity and be influential in my society, should I embrace markets or a government?
Well, so it seems to me that on the face of it, we can see, both kinds of alternatives in principle in play in different political and economic environments. Culture matters, and culture obviously needs to include a recognition on basic moral grounds of everybody's dignity. Allowing for that, however, allowing for the fact that sometimes people are treated badly by markets and sometimes they're treated well by government officials, nonetheless, it seems to me that one reason you might, at any rate, favor markets over governments is that, as a general matter, there are more options on offer in an open marketplace, and your ability to say no is presupposed. Again, we're talking about the kind of market that features rights of the sort I've noted earlier. And so as a result, since you can say no, people have in general an incentive to treat you well. And I mean, we often think perhaps that, say, in retail environments, we're treated fairly dismissively, but the reality is we nonetheless deal with a culture in which people don't in general laugh at the idea that the customer is always right. We note that in some other societies in which it's very easy for people to retain employment even when they behave quite badly, retail service can be very, very dismissive, and the customer is definitely not treated as right. Are things perfect in our society? And the answer is, of course not. There are real problems there, some of them cultural, some of them legal and structural. But the level of flexibility and the degree to which we enjoy the most basic guarantor of dignity, namely the right to say no, really, I think, gives us opportunities that interacting with the government doesn't. And if you want to be reminded of that, wait in line at the DMV. You're not there to get a service that you request. You're there to be, put through the ringer by people implementing rules that you had nothing to do with creating, and that are going to be imposed on you. Doesn't mean, obviously, the people you deal with in government settings can't sometimes be nice and agreeable people. I'm not trying to suggest that we're talking about a bunch of moral monsters, but I think the institutional incentives don't lead government agencies, and certainly government officials with considerable power, to be all that interested in your well-being or your preferences. You talked about government officials courting you, and undoubtedly they court you as the member of a big pool of voters or taxpayers or whoever, but they certainly don't have much reason to be terribly interested in you as an individual, because in fact you have no real option to say no. And I think by contrast, in a marketplace, your ability to say no is preserved, and I think that matters a great deal for how you're treated and for the options you confront.
I look at history and see women and minorities as being oppressed and the state as the correcting mechanism for solving said oppression. Why should I embrace the ideas of Center for a Stateless Society if my primary focus is to uplift the downtrodden?
So I think it's certainly right that we can look at history and we can see a great deal of exclusion and subordination, sometimes maintained actively through violence and sometimes maintained through a variety of societal pressures. What's clear is that governments are not populated by people who are forced, first and foremost, ascending to positions of power in order to make the world a better place. I think that's pretty straightforwardly because the one thing we know about people with power is that they're people who are interested in and adept at acquiring and maintaining power. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in positions of power. And that means, as a general rule, that such people are likely to be less principled, more ambitious than the average, or they wouldn't be where they are, and they're likely to be susceptible to pressures to act badly in a variety of ways. So I'm not just saying that they have more power than the rest of us, and so, like the rest of us, they sometimes pursue their own objectives at the interests of others. That's certainly true. But I'm also saying they're not as likely to be as principled as the rest of us. There's a kind of self-selection process involved. So I begin with the assumption that we don't have good reason to expect that good things will happen as a general matter for people without power, people who have been excluded and subordinated. The good things aren't likely to happen just because of the goodwill of people who have power. People who have power can be expected instead really to pay attention to the concerns of the marginalized in one way or another, only to the extent that they see some political advantage for this. So I don't think, first of all, that appeals to the good intentions of people with power are likely to get us very far. People with power, I think, can be expected to behave well, to behave, let's say, in ways that reflect opposition to exclusion and subordination. Largely, when there are cultural shifts involved, when there are economic shifts involved. We didn't, for instance, get legislation addressing child labor until the economy and culture had shifted enough that child labor was on the way out anyway. I think that similarly, if we think about the status of ethnic and cultural minorities, when we think about the status of women and gays and trans people, what we should expect in all of these cases is less than enthusiastic support from people with power. I don't think, because there are cultural issues involved often in subordination and exclusion, that we can just assume that market exchange on its own will be sufficient to address every concern that someone in an excluded or subordinated group might have. And I think there remains certainly room for nonviolent, peaceful, persuasive activism on behalf of inclusion and empowerment. But I do think at the same time it's worth noting that when people are motivated by irrational prejudice, when they are motivated by bigotry, they pay a tax, right? That is to say, they pay more in order to not do business with, not employ, not have as customers, not have as suppliers people in groups they disfavor, when they disfavor those groups on the basis of bigotry. And so there is, I think, a built-in tendency for markets to push back against bad choices on the part of social institutions and of business people and so forth. Again, not perfectly. I think there absolutely remains room for activism here, because in one way or another there may be sources of insulation against the expression of bigotry and prejudice. But I think we should see markets as counting quite strongly against the long-term viability of bigotry. I note, for instance, that let's say in South Africa, a clear example in the 20th century of institutionalized subordination and exclusion, that it wasn't the case that we had private businesses independently and freely maintaining consistent policies of apartheid. Rather, those had to be maintained by law precisely because they weren't in the interests of businesses to enforce. And so here's the other thing we note, that politicians not only aren't always prepared to act in support of the excluded and the marginalized, but also that they will very frequently use power actively to enforce the bigotry of those they take to be effective supporters. So I don't think there's a kind of magic response that shows that consensual institutions will perfectly address all problems, but I think we should be very skeptical about appeals to the good nature of states, and we should certainly recognize the corrosive effect that markets can exert on structures of privilege and exclusion.
Now, do you see the state as sort of like a neutral tool that you could sometimes use for good, sometimes for bad, sometimes it's efficient, or do you say that the state is a unique institution?
So I think that in the nature of the case, a state is distinctive. It's distinctive because it's a monopolist. If we're going to use roughly Max Weber's definition, the state claims to exercise, and at least reasonably successfully does exercise, a monopoly over, let's say, something like systemic force. Okay, so the point is not that whenever anybody exercises force, the state is there reviewing and approving that, or that the state is the only entity that ever does exercise force, but it claims the right to determine when individual acts of force are okay, and it in turn exercises force systemically throughout the society. So that's distinctive. That's, nobody else does that. It's not like the mafia, which even in a society that's riddled by the mafia, isn't sort of claiming public legitimacy. It's not claiming the right to do this, not claiming the moral entitlement to do this. It just kind of does it. And it's not, like some other institutions we might have. It's not like you defending your house from a robber, with a crossbow or something. It's society-wide, and it's concerned with violence in a systemic way. So there's really nothing else quite like a state, and as a result, it's uniquely dangerous, okay? It's uniquely dangerous, so just quantitatively, it exercises dominion over a far wider range of forcible acts than any other institution. It's also dangerous because it's a monopoly, and we all have good reason to be deeply skeptical about monopolies. They deny us options and therefore present us with take it or leave it, and sometimes just take it possibilities. And that means that we can't, by exercising choice, take other possibilities off the table, encourage others to give us options. And so we have minimal options, and we therefore have reduced services. and high prices. So if you think about what would happen if there were a monopoly on shoes, to use my friend Roderick Long's example, but think of a monopoly on anything else. So the state is a monopolist then with respect to the use of force, with respect to legal rights, and to ultimate legal procedures. Now, obviously, we can pursue other legal procedures, as long as the state doesn't get involved in precluding them. We can pursue mediation and arbitration and so forth. But ultimately, those are legally efficacious only because states enforce the relevant contracts and so forth. So states are bad because of their reach, because of the extent to which they exercise violence, and because they are monopolists and exclude alternatives. And, so they're geographic monopolists, right? So whether you're talking about a small state the size of Vatican City or Monaco, or a huge state the size of Russia, the idea is that if you want alternatives as regards legal institutions and legal rights, if you want to get away from the reach of a state, then what you have to do is leave the state's territory. And that can be economically costly, it can be emotionally and psychologically and culturally costly in a variety of ways. So while there is ordinarily, unless you have a particularly vile state like, say the states of, in the old Soviet bloc that actively prevented anyone from leaving. I still find that today in, I suppose, places like North Korea. You do have, if you're not in that kind of state, the freedom to exit, but exit at a very high cost. And of course, the cost gets greater the larger the state. Then, of course, the farther away you have to go if you want to evade its reach. And so the monopolistic power of the state makes it dangerous. It also makes it, of course, at the same time, attractive to people who, again, are interested in using power for their own benefit. There's a tremendous amount of power that's available, and that power can serve as a magnet for those who want to engage in mischief of various kinds. So I don't think the state is neutral because it is a non-consensual monopolist that imposes its authority on us, reduces our options, and from which it's relatively difficult to exit. We have real problems. Sometimes people juxtapose rights of voice to those of exit, and there's the claim that somehow we are affirming our dignity when we exercise voice. But the fact is, any but the tiniest of states isn't going to be influenced by our exercise of voice in the vast majority of cases. What I say, either as a voter or as somebody commenting on public matters, is going to have very, very little effect on general policies. So, I think the notion that the state is neutral and we can look to it to do good things, I suppose isn't just inherently insane in the sense that occasionally, a state might do something good, states might do things that we might do ourselves under other circumstances, but the state is fundamentally a clunky, monopolistic, violent, dangerous entity that attracts people who are up to mischief very frequently.
I see such inequality in America today. We have billionaires and homeless people. This is the result of free markets misallocating resources instead of focusing on people and their needs. It's just about money and rewarding greed. Why should I support markets?
Well, so it seems to me that we can definitely see tremendous economic vulnerability even in a very wealthy society like ours. And so it's certainly understandable that people see the vulnerability of homeless people and of recent immigrants and others, and can be deeply concerned, deeply troubled by that, and I think very appropriately so. The notion, however, that this is a result of the operation of markets doesn't seem to me to be right. I think that if we look at the drivers of structural poverty, we don't see markets as the culprit. So understand, there are, broadly speaking, we might think about others, but roughly speaking, I think we can say there are two kinds of poverty. There's situational poverty that results because I lost a job, or there's been a natural disaster or something like that. But the structural poverty that's persistent, ongoing, and a reflection of, if you will, the rules of the game. So the rules of the game, I submit, rules about everything from access to particular occupations to access to land, things that affect the cost of living. These are not sort of neutral features of the environment that are either created by or sustained by markets. Instead, it's impossible not to see these as products of profound and dangerous political rigging of market environments. The great Charles Johnson wrote a piece that I think has been very influential on many of us some years ago, called "Scratching By: How Government Creates Poverty as We Know It." And that's, for many people, will be a kind of offensive title. They'll push back at that. That can't possibly be right. But I think Charles does a great job of highlighting important ways in which that's precisely the case. That, say, occupational licensing rules limit people's access to occupations that might make them money. Those rules also drive up the cost of services provided by others. Just to take an obvious example, think about the costs of healthcare in the United States. Think about how much care might be provided by, say, by nurse practitioners that people instead have to obtain either directly from licensed physicians or, say, from nurse practitioners who are operating under the umbrella of physicians because of occupational licensing rules. And so as a result, people who try to provide those medical services without the relevant licenses could be subject to various kinds of legal liability. It's not an option for them. So whether I'm entering an occupation, I'd like to enter an occupation and I can't do so because of high costs of entry, or I'd like to obtain services from someone and I can only do that from someone who's going to charge quite a bit because of, again, high costs of entry. That's a factor. We can think about the ways in which access to land is limited by various kinds of land use controls, zoning rules, building codes, and so forth. We can run through a range of economic factors like this. It's interesting. There's a recent book co-authored by a libertarian, Brink Lindsay, and a progressive, Monopolies, who agree about the ways in which a number of important factors, from from rules to land use controls to say, the intellectual property rules, wealth to the well-connected, and keep a lot of people economically vulnerable. So I think it's certainly right to be concerned about the way in which the system creates vulnerability, but I would vigorously resist the notion that the way in which the system creates vulnerability is by allowing open market exchange. Instead, I think the system creates vulnerability precisely by rigging markets in favor of the privileged, and by the privileged here, ultimately, we mean those who are given privilege precisely by the political class, either members of the political class or companies, in ways that serve to concentrate wealth in the hands of the well-connected and exclude others. So I think that markets are not the cause of poverty. They're better seen as precisely the remedy for that.
Now, does the
bourgeois trilogy, Deirdre McCloskey, and more recently in a more popular treatment of the issues co-authored with Art Carden, Leave Me Alone, I'll Make You Rich, highlights what she famously has called the Great Enrichment, starting about 1800. The idea is that poverty has been, over the years, the natural condition of humankind. And even the wealthiest people a few hundred years ago enjoy, very few of the things that, quite ordinary people in our society regard as quite natural features of their lives. Whether McCloskey is right that the main shift since 1800 in allowing for the Great Enrichment has been the positive valuation of entrepreneurship, whether there have also been, as others have been inclined to claim, structural institutional changes, providing greater protection, for instance, for entrepreneurship and property rights. In any event, it's clear that pro-market changes in the past 200 years have made an enormous difference, and they've been an enormous difference by way of reducing poverty and offering greater empowerment.
Do we need regulation in the marketplace by the state in order to keep us safe from those seeking to exploit the vulnerable and take pernicious advantage of maybe people in vulnerable situations?
So obviously there are bad actors in any environment in which we're likely to find ourselves. And those bad actors can sometimes be expected to engage in fraud and to seek to manipulate vulnerable people. And I certainly think we ought to be not naive about that. And I don't think that a defense of markets can ever, should ever be predicated on the assumption that somehow, all market actors are good people and can always be expected to do the right thing. On the other hand, however, I think it's clear that when there aren't various sorts of privileges that insulate market actors against bad consequences for their actions, then even not particularly good actors are likely to feel some incentives to confront some incentives to behave well. And first of all, of course, there can be incentives provided by legal liability, right? If you're engaging in fraud, and I can sue you for that, that's obviously going to be something you're going to have to take into account. But even when there's not a legal liability in place, we can note that just reputational harm can be enough to encourage somebody to behave more responsibly. And if I'm aware that, perhaps what I've done wasn't the sort of thing that is, perhaps should be a trigger for legal liability, but that is really going to be seen as, in one way or another, manipulative, unfair, that can certainly result in reputational losses that will result, as long as there's an open market, in people's willingness to go elsewhere. On the other hand, I think it's worth emphasizing that regulation is not some kind of benign tool. And I'd say there are at least two things we should be concerned about. The first is that regulations characteristically are employed across the board. They're structured in across the board fashion. They affect everybody in very much the same way. And it's very hard for them to take individual circumstances into account, and the information that people on the ground possess can tend to be ignored when regulations are framed and enforced. The other thing to recognize is that regulations are going to be framed under the influence of the dominant players in a given industry, and they're going to be enforced very frequently by regulatory bodies drawn from the dominant players in the relevant industry, right? I mean, it's, so you might occasionally have a regulatory body in a given arena, that features, somebody who's been a longtime consumer advocate, but I think it's rather more likely to have somebody who moves from being, a member of a certain regulatory body to being the vice president for government affairs in a given business in the regulated area, and back and forth, a kind of revolving door in that regulatory space. So not only are markets surprisingly good at protecting people against bad behavior, but on the other hand, regulations can both be clumsy and unresponsive to situational particularities, and they can be driven and enforced by people from the relevant industries who want to use them to prop up their own positions, and very frequently raise the cost of doing business for competitors who might, for instance, be able to deliver goods and services at lower prices. Regulations can be used to keep them from doing that. There are great examples of this sort of thing in a number of books. One of them I'd certainly recommend is the great late Butler Schaefer. Butler Schaefer's book, In Restraint of Trade, The Business Campaign Against Competition, and then there, it's I think 1918 to 38 or 16 to 38, something like that. And, what Butler points out is the way in which the drive for greater regulation, notably the mechanisms that were employed in the so-called First New Deal, were mechanisms that were embraced by large, well-connected businesses. They weren't seen on the whole as bad by those businesses. Rather, they were used to maintain a kind of steady rate of profit for big businesses and to keep them from being attacked by upstart competitors that might cut into their profits by serving consumers more efficiently. And so that's not obviously the only story with respect to any regulation, but I think that's an aspect of the regulatory environment that's often overlooked.
Do we need a state to provide antitrust laws to protect us from monopolies?
Yeah, so I think in general the answer to that question is just no. I think that the state is a monopoly, of course, and some, I think I'd like to see antitrust laws applied primarily to the state. I think the rise of antitrust legislation, very often, again, I think has been used to get in the way of benefits for consumers. Such legislation is sold as intended to benefit consumers, but again, in an environment in which there is the absence of barriers to entry, in which people can start new firms and try different ways of doing things, a sort of de facto monopoly that's exercised by a single player in a given market is ordinarily going to be impossible to maintain. If you think about even, let's say, an oligopoly with a group of firms trying to maintain a cartel to keep prices high, the reality is it's going to be very tempting for a given member of that cartel to defect, right? To at least under the table offer better prices than the cartel itself is offering, and so because of that, in general, to maintain a cartel, to maintain like let's say an oligopoly for a small group of firms. What's needed is precisely regulation that excludes competitors or that requires competitors to go along with the cartel. As long as I can compete with the cartel, if the cartel is charging a lot, then as long as it's it's got a big profit margin that I can cut into by entering the relevant market, then I can certainly do so. And as a general matter, a rational firm is going to be aware of this possibility. Even if there aren't other players in the market right now, the possibility of entry is going to be sufficient in general to discipline a rational player. And so On the one hand, as I say, I think antitrust legislation has very often been used to, in fact, inhibit vigorous competition that's actually beneficial to consumers. It's exercised the powers that regulators have under antitrust laws, often exercised for the benefit of other market players, of other firms that are playing in the market, not for the benefit of consumers. And I think we can see, by contrast, that in a genuinely open market, maintaining monopolies is not something that's going to be easy. Indeed, again, we see that when there are monopolies, they are maintained precisely by regulatory support for existing players. So if we think about traditionally in older, say, Anglo-American law, a monopoly, it was recognized, it was something that you enjoyed precisely because you got a special privilege, a special charter from the government. Then people started to kind of talk about de facto monopolies by analogy, but the situation of that de facto monopoly is characteristically very different in a situation where there's no forcible exclusion of alternatives, and instead you're just talking about one or a small number of current participants in a given market. It's important where that phenomenon exists to ask why it exists and whether indeed there is some regulatory barrier to entry. And if there's not, again, one might want to ask whether indeed the possibility of competition is still disciplining performance, even by a limited number of players in the market. Again, this is an ongoing process. It's not to say that at any one moment, any market is behaving with perfect efficiency. That's a piece of fantasy. A market is an ongoing process of equilibration and discovery. And so at any one point, people may be making, in one way or another, ill-informed or bad decisions. But what markets do have is the ability to bring about ongoing equilibration, not perfect equilibrium, but ongoing discovery and readjustment that has the potential certainly to be profoundly beneficial to consumers.
What about the idea that in the marketplace, in order to live and survive, I have to work, I have to be laboring, I have to be constantly pleasing other people. But if I embrace a state, well, I could get a universal basic income and others can do the working for me. I mean, why should I have to work to live?
Well, ultimately, the idea, I think, behind markets is that as you say, I make money by pleasing other people, by serving. I'm rewarded. I'm rewarded for the effectiveness with which I serve other people. And so since those other people are all of us, right, we all depend on each other. We need a mechanism for securing cooperation. So it's not going to be the case that any society is going to function effectively if most people expect that without serving others, without any kind of acceptance of reciprocal obligations and of responsiveness to others, they're going to be cared for. I think that's a recipe, it seems to me, for societal collapse. So obviously, I think any decent society will feature mechanisms for the provision of support to temporarily or persistently vulnerable people. That's another matter. But if the general mechanism of operation of the society, the method of operation of the society, doesn't involve people cooperating with each other to provide goods and services that others want, then the society, it seems to me, runs into a real problem. We know that the division of labor in which people focus on particular things, they develop expertise and they use that expertise in a focused way, that tends to yield widespread societal prosperity. People can depend on each other to participate in networks of extended social cooperation and can benefit from that. On a model instead in which everybody expects to be, to be a ward of the state, I think that's a really serious kind of problem, because it means that people in general have given up on cooperating with each other for mutual betterment, and instead have just expected that they will depend on others, and they will in effect exploit others. So again, I don't think we should view vulnerable people as inherently exploitative. If we have a society that eliminates those structural features that make and keep people poor, then we will dramatically reduce the risk of poverty. But we recognize there is still situational economic vulnerability. Again, think about a case in which people are orphaned, or a case in which a natural disaster strikes. And I think it's very important to have mechanisms for mutual aid, networks that provide people with support in case of that kind of vulnerability. And I think both for our own benefit and as a matter of, I think, appropriate concern for others, we have good reason to participate in such networks. But that's very different from supposing that the right way to handle things is to have the state just provide sort of uniform support for people as a general alternative to work. So of course there have been libertarians of various sorts. One thinks of among the leading 20th century libertarians, Hayek, Friedman, who certainly contemplated the possibility of something like basic income schemes, but because they weren't anarchists. I'm here talking in what's broadly an anarchist mode. But we can certainly understand why a libertarian might think in those terms. And certainly I think a basic income scheme, which you mentioned, is vastly preferable to the sort of crazy quilt of, complex market distorting mechanisms for economic support that, existing state institutions provide. But I think it is important to recognize that where those kinds of basic income schemes are provided by states that, in societies where people haven't seen the wisdom of anarchism yet, you still can't have a culture and a set of economic institutions that assume that a society can operate without it being the case that most people participate in networks of extended social cooperation, providing goods and services that other people want.
I want everyone to have health care. Why should I embrace the ideas of markets?
So what we might want to say about medical care is, I think, deeply related to what we might want to say about poverty, right? So very often concerns related to the accessibility of medical care are related to the high cost of such care and at the same time the inability of people with limited resources to obtain access to it. So I think that the first thing, again, if you want to contemplate a market-based response to the concern that you've articulated, is to think hard about the need to eliminate those institutions and practices that make and keep people poor. And as I've suggested, there's a whole range of things that we might want to eliminate there that make it hard for people to earn income as they prefer, and that raise the cost of living when they do have income, and make basic goods and services from housing to food and so forth harder to obtain. The other thing to note here that's especially important to begin with is that medical care itself is rendered ridiculously expensive in a variety of ways. And so First of all, as I've already suggested, licensing requirements for medical care providers of various kinds, obviously physicians, but many others as well. Those licensing requirements drive up costs dramatically. But think about other kinds of details as well. We can think about everything from medical device patents to drug patents to the FDA approval process for drugs to the licensing mechanisms that are employed to limit the availability, say, of hospitals, so-called certificates of need that have to be obtained that are basically designed to limit competition in the relevant area. And so there's a broad range of things that dramatically increase the cost of medical care to people. Say if we think about insurance as something that's needed, certainly for catastrophic care, for big ticket items like cancer surgery, then it certainly matters that insurance is not always readily available, and that indeed there are cartelizing rules that prevent sometimes the sale of insurance across state lines, things of that nature as well. And so for all of these reasons, then, it seems to me, medical care is much more expensive than it needs to be, or than we could reasonably expect it to be, even as at the same time, people in general are less well off than they certainly should be in a freed market, and in particular, the most economically vulnerable are rendered much more vulnerable there. So I think we can close the gap there between people's needs and what's available in a way that involves eliminating the privileges that prop up the cost of medical care and that reduce people's incomes and therefore their access to it directly and certainly through insurance mechanisms and so forth. So I think that in addition, the kinds of mutual aid networks that I referred to earlier that were important aspects of the provision of security to people in the face of health challenges in the 19th and early 20th centuries, certainly it seems to me can be reestablished and empowered in the 21st century. So I think it's an entirely reasonable goal to want to expand access and the quality of care. And at the same time, I think it's important to recognize that the state isn't the only way to do that, and that states have indeed, it seems to me, played important roles in dramatically increasing the cost of care. My friend Roderick Long has a great essay drawing on the historical work of people like David Beto and David Green, an essay called How Government Solved the Healthcare Crisis. And he's concerned here with the way in which the cost of medical care was dramatically reduced by the availability of, say, mass purchase on the part of people in mutual aid networks in the 19th century. The crisis here was precisely that from the standpoint of the politically influential players in the situation, namely the organized medical profession, the prestige and especially the remuneration of physicians was decreasing. If, say, a mutual aid group could, hire a physician full time, that didn't really seem to reflect the kind of professional, prestige that physicians wanted. It certainly meant that, while young physicians could do this and make money as they entered the profession, this had the effect of driving down what the incomes that established physicians were able to gain. And the practical effect was that they actively encouraged legislatures to get rid of these arrangements. They sought to blackball their own members who participated. And of course, Increasingly these medical societies had state privileges that had to do with licensing, and so blackballing members really gave them the power to exclude those whose competition was driving down their incomes and so forth. So the point is that we should recognize not only that markets can provide much less costly medical care than is on offer right now, but that to look to the state is a bit of a problem, because the state can be seen as a player precisely in the increase of costs and therefore the limitation of access that we confront.
Final question, sir. Thank you so much for being generous with your time. Is the employee-employer relationship inherently exploitative, as in, I have to work for someone in order to live, and they reap a surplus value, only employing me knowing they will make money off of me? Is this inherently exploitative, thus immoral, thus in need of abolition?
So I think that the short answer is no. Then we have to get into a more complicated answer. There are a variety of market distortions which shape the background conditions against which the employment relation very often occurs. I think that many of us in employment situations don't necessarily find those terribly appealing. It's not a lot of fun often to be pushed around by people above us in organizational hierarchies. And we may find that those organizational hierarchies don't well off for the same reasons that hierarchical states don't function well, right? So we think about the way in which big hierarchical states confront, broadly speaking, two kinds of problems, right? They confront incentive problems. Decision makers who try to manage the economy very often confront incentives that involve them in choosing for their own benefit or the benefit of their cronies rather than for those of ordinary consumers. And they also confront informational problems because, as Mises and Hayek showed us, the information that's needed to make economic decisions is distributed throughout society at the grassroots level, and no one person has or could have it. Well, those same problems occur in large organizations, and while not perhaps to the same degree, nonetheless, a hierarchical corporation often involves decision makers who don't know what's going on at the grassroots level, don't have the information that's on offer there. There aren't prices to provide that information as there are in a market economy, and those top level decision makers often again are acting for their own benefit more than for the benefit of shareholders or of employees. So I think there really are economic pressures that might well be expected to yield smaller, flatter organizations in which there would be more opportunity for participatory decision making, or indeed for participatory ownership, as in partnerships or co-ops. And I think a lot of us might benefit from that. Sometimes, however, what seems to be happening is that the state is responsible for a whole range of privileges that can insulate large, well-connected organizations against the pressures that might otherwise lead to their replacement by smaller, flatter alternatives. Again, it's always more complicated than that because, for instance, while self-employment offers a lot more freedom, it can also offer a great deal of responsibility and therefore pressure. If you have to come up with startup capital yourself, that can be a much tougher and more risky undertaking. And so therefore, I think some people might quite reasonably, in some circumstances, prefer to work for others rather than to work for themselves. But I think even in those cases, if we had reduced pressures if we eliminated the support, I think, that's provided to top-heavy hierarchical organizations, then even in organizations in which employment was the primary source of labor rather than self-employment, work for others was the primary source of labor, it might well be the case, I think, you'd see more pressure for fairer and more participatory organizations that took advantage of people's knowledge and also treated them with greater dignity. I don't think that, therefore, employment is in principle exploitative, but I think many employment situations aren't very pleasant. I think most of us prefer not to be pushed around, and I think in a genuinely open market, we might expect to experience a good deal less of that.
The books are Anarchy and Legal Order, Law and Politics for a Stateless Society, and Economic Justice and Natural Law. Check them out at GaryChartier.net, link in the description. Sir, thank you so much for your time.
Have a great day. Thank you for having me.